Thanks everyone for joining us today on this. I'm just looking out the window, this dark and cold late November afternoon, evening. But I do appreciate you all taking your time to join the webinar this afternoon. Yeah, my name's Dr. Dan Renshaw, and I teach modern British and European history at the University of Reading. I teach on quite a lot of stuff, but my main research focus is on immigration and identity. And that's really what's led me to the topic that we're going to be discussing today. So I'm currently writing a book, hopefully going to be published next year, on the British churches and immigration in the 20th century. And my second chapter is going to be on the churches and the presence of foreigners in Britain during the First World War. But to better understand that relationship, I also had to think about how the British churches and organised faith in Britain more widely viewed the conflict when it was happening and subsequently, and also how the churches and organised religion were viewed in British society between 1914 and 1919. So that's what led me to the subject we're going to be discussing today. In a minute, I'm going to give a bit of background context on organised religion in Britain before the First World War. But I thought before we do that, it'd be worth just thinking about what we really associate with the conflict, what we associate with the Great War of 1914 to 1918. I'm sure we've all got some strong associations with the war, possibly because of what you've already studied, or cultural representations of the conflict that you've seen. But I thought, first of all, we could have a quick poll, just your primary associations with the First World War. So Morgan's put the poll up. You don't have to choose just one, but I'd say choose the 2 or 3 of these 5 aspects of the conflict that immediately come to mind when you think of the war. Okay, so there's very much a focus, so it's sort of shifting. So a lot of focus on geopolitics and the alliance system. So the reason the war broke out in the first place, which was the international relations in Europe in the 20 years before the conflict. And then also a lot of interest in the trenches, so the futility of the military conflict, what was happening in France and Flanders, and also some interest in technological change, of course, which there was a lot during the war, including a lot of military innovation as well, and also remembrance, so how the conflict is viewed after it concludes. And of course, we had Remembrance Day earlier this month, but not much association with the home front and social change, which is good because that's what I'm going to be discussing mostly today. So hopefully a lot of this material will be quite new to you. Okay, so here's a bit of background context. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint. Religion in Britain before 1914, just to give you an idea of different faiths in Britain and their relative positions in British society. So at the beginning of the 19th century, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, is really the only officially recognised religious body in the country. By 1900, that is no longer the case. Most religions in Britain have a formal legal status by 1900, but the Church of England is the state church, as indeed it is today. The monarch, the king or queen, is the defender of the faith, and that faith is the Anglican faith. And that means the Church of England has certain privileges and it has access to the channels of power as well. So, for instance, Church of England bishops and archbishops, they sit in the House of Lords. So that brings the Church of England a lot of privileges, but also an expectation that it will support the British state in its ventures, which is going to be important for when we discuss its role during the war. You also have other forms of Protestant Christianity, which aren't related to the Church of England, and which we include under the overall banner of non-conformism. And non-conformism is really a response to social and economic changes that take place in Britain in the 19th century as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which you may have studied. So nonconformist Protestantism is especially a religion of the new industrial working class. And Protestantism in its nonconformist form places a lot of emphasis on personal behavior. So, for instance, abstaining from alcohol, not gambling, attending church on a Sunday, and all those sort of outward signs of faith. You also have the Catholic Church, which by 1900 is largely a faith of migrants, significant for my particular field of study. So especially Irish Catholic, Italian Catholic, German Catholic migrants, but also of a small British elite as well. And you also have non-Christian religious communities in Britain at the beginning of the 20th century as well, the largest of which is Jewish communities in Britain, which includes British Jewish communities and also a large Eastern European migrant population who have travelled to Britain from Eastern Europe over the last 25 years. And then in particular areas, so especially port areas of cities like Cardiff, Glasgow, East London, you have smaller non-Christian communities, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, but quite small at this point before the First World War. So that's just to give an idea of where we are in terms of religious faith before the war begins. So you probably all got quite a strong idea of what happens at the outbreak of the First World War and how people across Europe respond to the declaration of war. And I think that the general idea we have is, as you can see from the photo I've shared in the PowerPoint slide, large patriotic crowds gathering in cities, flying flags, singing national anthems. So this sort of hyper-nationalism, hyper-xenophobia. And in some ways, that partially does take place. So you do get these large crowds meeting in London on the 4th of August when Britain enters the war. The war has already begun by this point. Singing patriotic songs. The windows of the German embassy are all smashed in at the beginning of the war. So there is that element of hyper-nationalism, xenophobia, jingoism, as it's referred to at the time. But the prevalent feeling, by all accounts, from looking at accounts of people's experiences at the start of the war, is just this feeling of strangeness, that British society is in this new situation. It's no longer peacetime, and yet people don't really know what the war is going to involve. The declaration of war takes place at the end of a bank holiday. So a lot of British people have been travelling and are still travelling when the war is declared. People have gone down to the south coast or the east coast, to the seaside. They've been on holiday, and suddenly they're reading in the news. And of course, news spreads slower in 1914 than it does today, but it's still disseminated relatively rapidly. People are reading in the news that Britain is now at war with Germany, and people don't know what's going to come next. In some respects, the war has been expected for a long time, certainly the last 5 or 6 years, when it's clear that Germany is a geopolitical rival of Britain's, and as you guys mentioned in the poll, they're in rival alliance systems. In some ways, the war has been expected and indeed anticipated favorably by some people, but when it actually happens, there's still this feeling of strangeness. And that's evident on the part of the churches as well, or rather the clergy who represent the churches. Many, especially Christian clergy in Britain, immediately before the outbreak of the war, have been campaigning against Britain's involvement in the conflict. They say Britain should not be involved in this war. But once the war is declared, there's a huge amount of pressure for church bodies and religious organisations in the United Kingdom to get behind the British war effort. And this is largely what happens immediately after war is declared. So the next Sunday after Britain's declared war on Germany, across the country, people are attending church services. And you have priests and vicars and pastors standing up, speaking in the pulpit, giving sermons, and telling their congregations, well, this is our position on the war. And by extension, this should be your position on the war as well. And almost universally, at the beginning of the First World War, religious leaders in Britain announced their support for the conflict. Here is a lengthy paragraph. I'm not going to read all of it, from a Protestant journal called the British Weekly from the 6th of August 1914. So this would be the first edition published after Britain declares war on Germany. Just for a bit of context here, so Germany and France are already at war by July 1914. And then the German army, as part of its plan to invade northern France, it attacks Belgium, which Britain is committed to upholding Belgium's neutrality. And so Germany is given an ultimatum, which it doesn't respond to, and so Britain declares war on Germany. I mean, in reality, Britain would have had to have declared war on Germany in any case at some point. Germany is just too much of a geopolitical threat. But the invasion of Belgium gives it this good moral cause. And this is something very much that people trying to generate this support for the British war effort focus on at the start of the war, that this is a war Britain's been forced into by an aggressive German military action. But in any case, so you can see this paragraph from the British Weekly immediately after war is declared. And if you read through it, you can see, I mean, this is a declaration of support for the British war effort, but it's not hugely enthusiastic if you read the text. And essentially it says, pretty much up to 2 days ago, we were campaigning for peace, that this war should not be happening. But now we are at war with Germany, it is our duty to support Britain in this conflict. So very quickly, the British churches are being called upon to indicate, give a moral position on what the war is about. What is this being fought for? Why are the British Army being deployed in France and Belgium? Why are soldiers already dying in this conflict? How can we justify this? And how does this fit into our ideas of what our religion is about? Not all religious figures in Britain during the war support the war effort. And actually, the conscientious objector movement, so people who on a moral principle refuse to fight in the war or to support Britain's war effort, or you say the war is immoral or should not be being waged, often their opposition to the war is based on religious sentiment, that you cannot reconcile supporting military conflict and religious faith. So religion does play an important role in opposition to the war, but a large majority of clergy of different forms of Christianity and of other religious faiths such as Judaism, they announce support for the war effort. And that's partly because of genuine belief that this is a war that has to be fought and that it's right that this this should be fought. But there's also, as you might imagine, just a huge amount of societal pressure, especially as the casualties begin to mount, and also from the state, from the government as well, to support the war effort and to find a moral justification for it. It has to be said that before the First World War, there are very close links between British and German religious institutions and between Britain and Germany generally. I mean, they're not allies. Militarily, it's pretty clear from about 1907, 1908 that Germany's going to be an opponent at some point. But there are all these different connections. I mean, probably the most apparent one, which you're probably all thinking of now, is the royal family. The British King, George V, is a direct relative of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. They're both related to Queen Victoria. And the British ruling house in 1914 is the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. Immediately after the war is declared, the royal family changed their dynastic name to the House of Windsor, which sounds much more British and patriotic. So you have all these close connections between the two societies, between their royal families and between the churches as well. Immediately before the war is declared, there's all this correspondence which is available in the Anglican archives now between the British churches and the German churches about holding these joint events in 1916, which are going to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Martin Luther's challenge to the Catholic Church. So one of the key points in the early Reformation. And of course, this doesn't happen because war is declared, but it gives an indication of these close bonds that exist up to 1914. But then obviously, once the war starts, all of this changes, and it changes very rapidly. In late August 1914, you have this very ill-tempered exchange of correspondence, publicly published, between the British churches, British Protestant churches, that I should say, and the German Protestant churches, essentially each side saying, well, it's your country's fault that this war is being fought. Okay, we are morally justified in waging this war, you are not, and this is the correct Christian position on the subject. So you have this very public, and this is probably inevitable that this would happen, but this very public falling out between the British and German churches, and then essentially, for all intents and purposes, relationships are broken off between the British and German church structures. The Catholic Church, it's a bit more complicated than that, as we'll return to later in this talk, because obviously to a greater degree than the Protestant churches, I mean, the Protestant churches are transnational. So, you know, Anglicanism is an international faith. There are smaller Protestant groups, which you find both in Germany and Britain. But the Catholic Church is an explicitly international organization led by the Pope in Rome. And the Pope during the First World War sticks to this position of neutrality and also saying the war needs to come to an end. So yeah, for the Catholic Church, it's a somewhat different situation, and you don't have this very public falling out between Catholic churches in Germany and Britain. But for the Protestant churches, essentially they break off relations with each other. And so the churches are asked to provide this moral narrative, especially about why the war is being fought. Why are we involved in this conflict? And that narrative shifts as the war goes on, and in certain respects becomes more extreme as it becomes clear this is not going to be a short war, and as the casualties mount, this is incredibly bloody and destructive conflict. And obviously you've got these heightened emotions at home and a sort of antipathy, certainly in Britain by early 1915, an antipathy towards anything perceived as German. So right from the start, the British churches say, well, this war has to be fought. This is a necessity. We can't be neutral. We can't stand back from this. And at first, that is given a very sort of practical justification. You know, if Britain allows Belgium to be occupied, if it allows France to be defeated, then Britain will be next. Britain will be invaded. I mean, that probably wasn't going to happen, but that's the language of the time. Britain's going to be subjugated to Germany, so this war has to be fought. It also has a moral element because Belgium, this small neutral country, has been invaded by Germany. And the atrocities of the German army in Belgium form this key part of early British wartime propaganda. Again, if we don't fight this war now, eventually we'll be fighting it on British soil instead. And so early church language on the need to fight the war very much stresses that practical element, but also the violation of Belgian neutrality. What starts to shift from probably about late 1914 to early 1915 onwards is positioning Germany itself, either the German state or the German army or even the German population or all three, as essentially a threat to Christianity. Okay, that Christianity in Germany isn't a genuine form of Christianity, and that this war is not just being fought for geopolitical reasons or even moral reasons in terms of defending Belgium, that this is actually a war for Christianity and to preserve Christianity. And that if Germany wins, it won't just be Britain's geopolitical position that will be imperiled, it will be the Christian faith itself. Here are some brief quotes from various clergy in Britain near the beginning of the war. So this is Henry Scott Holland, who's an Anglican priest. He says, just after the declaration of the war, God must win. We cannot have anything else. And you can see discursively what he's doing here is saying, well, the British war effort and the Christian religion are essentially synonymous, okay? And that if Britain is defeated, God will be defeated as well. The Baptist preacher John Clifford. John Clifford's really interesting because 14 years before, he had opposed Britain's involvement in the Boer War, this war going on in South Africa, this colonial war. And he had become quite a controversial figure at the beginning of the 20th century for publicly standing up and saying Britain should not be fighting this war. This is an immoral war. By 1914, his position has changed. And again, he says Britain has to fight this war for moral purposes. He describes Germany as a tyranny robed in the garb of civilization. He says the struggle is an armed resistance for the most precious ethical and Christian ideas. So these church leaders are saying you're not just fighting for your country, you're fighting for Christianity as well. And then we have another shift presenting Germany as this anti-Christian, even pagan society. So there's a guy called William Michael Glazebrook, another Anglican, who says Germany has reverted to the worship of Odin and Thor, so the Norse gods, to a gospel of force and hatred. So essentially, Germany has gone back to a sort of pre-Christian Viking morality. Okay, but it's renounced Christianity. That image you can see on the PowerPoint, or I hope you can see at least, is from a book published in 1915. It's actually for children. It's called The Gods of Prussia and Other Stories. It's written by a Christian author called Margaret Yeo and published by a church publishing house. And it's an extraordinary story. It's published for the purposes of propaganda, but it presents the Germans as blood-drinking cannibals. It has the Kaiser drinking blood from a cup, and it has the German army renouncing Christ and embracing pagan worship instead. So you can chart this sort of escalation of language in the first 18 months of the war, from this is a war we didn't want to happen, but now it's happening, you know, it's our patriotic duty to support it, even if we agree with it or not, to this is a war that is geopolitically necessary, to this is a war that is morally necessary, to this is a war actually for religion, and the religion itself is at stake. Right, these two figures you can see now are Cosmo Lang and Arthur Winnington Ingram. Cosmo Lang on my left and Arthur Winnington Ingram on my right. So these are both senior Church of England clergy, and they're friends as well. So Arthur Winnington Ingram is Bishop of London, so one of the most prominent Anglican leaders in the country. Cosmo Lang is Bishop of York, so also very prominent. And he used to be Bishop of Stepney in the East End. So Lang and Winnington Ingram worked together quite closely. So they're two of the most well-known religious figures in Britain at the beginning of the war. And I'm just referring to them because they give a good indication of what happens if you don't tailor your spiritual message to fit the propaganda and the feeling of the time in those early that early part of the war. So Cosmo Lang makes a speech in November 1914. So the war's been going on for about 3 months. By the time he gives this speech, there's already been mass casualties in Flanders and France. The British Army has sustained heavy losses. And Cosmo Lang, in his speech, he's not renouncing the war. He's affirming his support for the war. He's just saying, like, we've got to hold on a bit. We've got to rein this in. And he says, well, you know, the Kaiser visited Britain 4 years ago. We have all these connections with Germany. Yes, we're at war with Germany now, but they're still human, and we still have this common history. And he attracts a huge amount of criticism for making this speech, and he essentially becomes persona non grata for the duration of the war. Like, he's isolated, he's frozen out until the end of the conflict. And then this guy, Arthur Winnington Ingram, the guy on the right, he takes very much the other path. Winnington Ingram has this increasingly bloodthirsty rhetoric in his sermons and his speeches. By 1915, he is calling for the extermination of the German people, for which he does get some criticism from within the church, but generally he's really popular. He's probably the most popular religious leader in wartime Britain, and he has collections of his patriotic wartime sermons bound and published as part of the propaganda effort. So those are the two paths you can go down. You can go with Cosmo Lang and try and inject some realism, or at least some awareness of history, into all of this, or Arthur Winnington Ingram, who very much embraces the spirit of the time and tailors his religious message to suit that. And just to conclude this part of the discussion, here's a quote from the Dean of Westminster, Herbert Ryle. In 1915, he ends a sermon with the claim, "War is not the worst evil, nor is the preservation of life the greatest good." So yeah, it gives you an idea of how these narratives have shifted. So this is one of the points I'm really interested in as a historian of migration. What happens to people from other countries who are either in Britain when the war breaks out, and how does that affect their experiences, or people who end up in Britain as a result of the conflict? And the First World War, like all wars, leads to displacement of peoples across Europe, including in Belgium, which the German army invades at the beginning of Britain's involvement in the war. And you have this mass movement of Belgian people out of the country, many to France, but about 250,000 of them arrive in Britain. And generally, there's a lot of support in British society for the Belgian refugees, really for two reasons. First of all, Belgium's the apparent cause that Britain is fighting for. So these people are a physical representation of the justness of the British cause in the First World War. Secondly, there's an understanding that the refugees will leave when the war is concluded. So they are only here temporarily. The British state essentially passes on responsibility for supporting the refugees to religious institutions. And there's very much this idea that different religious groups will look after Belgians of a particular, of the same religious faith. So Protestants will look after Protestants, Catholics will look after Catholics, Jewish communal groups will look after Jewish Belgian refugees, which is what the Jewish religious charities largely do. For the Christian Belgian refugees, it's a bit more complex. There's this understanding that the Catholic Church will look after Catholic refugees, but most Belgian refugees are Catholic. And as I said, there's 250,000 of them. The Catholic Church does not have the resources to look after all these people. Generally, it's Catholic volunteers who will meet Belgian refugees initially, but in the long term, they don't have the infrastructure to care for all these people. And so you have Protestant church groups looking after Belgian refugees as well. And you might say now, well, great, that's interreligious cooperation, what's called ecumenicism. Cooperation between different doctrines, that's what we want to see, very much so. The problem is the Catholic Church is really worried that Protestant groups are going to try and convert Belgian refugees away from the Catholic Church to bring them to Protestantism. And so you have this mutual support, you have this alliance, but you have these tensions as well, and quite profound Catholic suspicion of Protestant motives in caring for the refugees. This is one of the things I really trying to sort of get to the heart of in the chapter I'm writing about the First World War, why there are these tensions and then how they play out over the course of the conflict. And you also have smaller refugee groups, such as refugees from Serbia, which is on the Allied side during the First World War, who end up in London in much smaller numbers than the Belgian refugees. But that presents its own issues as well. So, for instance, there's no Serbian Orthodox Church in London. So where are the refugees going to worship? And they ask if they can share a Russian Orthodox Church, and that request is refused. The Greek Orthodox Church offers the use of one of their premises, but then in the end, the Serbian refugees can't use it because of geopolitical tensions in southeastern Europe, so hundreds of miles away between Greece and Serbia. And eventually the Anglican Church repurposes one of their chapels for the Serbians to use. But this is one of the things I find really interesting, the ambiguities about religious status, particularly of migrants in Britain during the war. And just as you have refugees who arrive in Britain are generally viewed very sort of positively, you also have large numbers of people in Britain at the start of the conflict who are classified as enemies once the war begins. Britain has a large German migrant population. It's one of the largest migrant populations in the country in 1914. And you have university students who are spending a year in a British university. You even have tourists who just really, with really bad timing and really bad luck, they're in Britain when the war is declared. In any case, pretty much as soon as Britain enters the war, a piece of legislation called the Aliens Restriction Act is passed. And that essentially says all foreigners who aren't from the British Empire living in Britain are either now friendly aliens or enemy aliens. In other words, they're nationals of a state that Britain is now at war with. And your life and your experience is dramatically impacted by that status. And then over the course of the conflict, large numbers of German and Austrian men who could potentially fight in the German army are interned. They're put in internment camps. This doesn't happen all in one go, but it does happen over the course of the war. And by 1918, most Germans still in Britain have been interned. Women, children, and the elderly are largely deported in the early months of the conflict. At the start of the war, you have what's called spy fever. Okay, British society sees spies everywhere. They think there's all this German espionage taking place, and there's a campaign of sabotage that's about to begin. Now, this is almost entirely imaginary. This does not happen, but this is the feeling of 1914, that there are Germans sort of hidden everywhere, and they've got to be sort of rooted out and imprisoned. I found some extraordinary correspondence in the Anglican archives from the Archbishop of Canterbury. There's a guy called Randall Davidson from 1914, where he writes to the Home Secretary saying he thinks a neighbour of his is a German spy. I'm pretty sure he's mistaken in this, but it gives you this idea of the spirit of the time, which is partly fostered by figures like Arthur Winnington Ingram, who are giving these incredibly violent and hyper-nationalistic sermons. In any case, so by the end of the war, you have large numbers of both German internees and also prisoners of war who've been captured on the front line in Britain, in camps. And the churches and other religious groups, such as Jewish charitable groups, they take on responsibility for making sure that these people can worship freely in their confinement, that there are priests and pastors and rabbis who can administer religious provision to them, and that they can celebrate religious holidays like Christmas, Easter, Passover, and Hanukkah. So the churches play an active part in this, especially a group called the Society of Friends, who are better known as the Quakers. And the Quakers, who generally oppose the war on moral grounds and get a whole load of criticism for doing so, they play a really key role in making sure people's religions and religious needs are respected in the internment and POW camps. One other thing to say is during the war, you have German churches still open. They're one of the few obvious signs of German identity which doesn't cease once the war begins. And these German churches themselves attract protests and violence by anti-German groups, such as the British Empire Union and the Anti-German Union. So they're sort of picketing outside the churches, windows are smashed, sometimes the churches themselves are invaded. Okay, but religion isn't just playing a role in the home front during the First World War, it's there on the front line as well. And you have in the British Army what are called chaplains, okay, who are representatives of religious faith and there to minister to the soldiers. And you have Protestant chaplains, Anglican chaplains, Catholic chaplains, Jewish chaplains on the front line. This causes quite a lot of controversy though. So in France, if you're a priest or a clergyman, you are not exempt from conscription. you still have to go and fight in the army, okay? And thousands of French priests do. Remember, France, unlike Britain, is a secular state. In Britain, it's specifically the law that chaplains, people who have become ordained religious leaders on any level, cannot fight. They cannot hold a gun. They cannot take life as part of the war. And then even after conscription is introduced into Britain in 1916, at the beginning of 1916, essentially not enough people are joining up now to, I mean, to put it brutally, people are dying in such large numbers that they're not being replaced by voluntary soldiers. So British state has to introduce conscription. That's what it does. But anyway, even when conscription is introduced, clergy are exempt from it. And there's a popular feeling, a sort of resentment against the clergy, that they are cowards or hypocrites for not fighting. And you also get a large amount of resentment by young clerics, perhaps people who became a priest or a vicar or a clergyman just before the war began, that they cannot go and fight. So I think we've got another poll, and this is a very straightforward one. Do we think it's right that chaplains were exempted from military service, from actually fighting on the front line? What do we reckon? Okay, shifting. Okay, so exactly 50-50, an even split. Oh no, hold on a second. No, a majority of us are saying that no, they should not have been exempt from conscription. Okay, interesting. Well, this is the general feeling of the time. And eventually the law is changed. And in March 1918, which is right at the end of the conflict, in March 1918, it looks actually like Germany's going to win the war. There's a final push by the German army to get to Paris. And the Allied armies are pushed back, and then they sort of manage to hold on. There's enough American soldiers arriving across the Atlantic to bolster the Allied side. But anyway, there's a sort of crisis point at the beginning of 1918, and they changed the rules, and people who've been ordained can go and actually fight. But yeah, there's generally the spirit of the time is that this is hypocritical, and chaplains should not be exempt from conscription. Okay, and then we get to the end of the war. The guns fall silent. You get to a point, November 1918, which many people thought would never come. There's a sort of feeling by 1917 that maybe this war is just going to go on forever. I mean, why not? It could last 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, and then seemingly quite abruptly it stops. And that's because the German state collapses in on itself. The German army doesn't. The German army is still there in the field and returns to its homeland in good order, but the German state implodes, the Kaiser flees the country, a republic is declared, and we're at peace. But it doesn't feel like a society at peace after the war. There's still a huge amount of this hyper-nationalism, xenophobia, hatred of Germany, a feeling that Germany should be punished for what it's done after the war. Here's a speech you can see on the PowerPoint slide by Randall Davidson, the Archbishop of Canterbury, given a few months after the end of the conflict. Essentially, he's petitioning in the House of Lords for a more humane policy towards Germans after the war. You can't hate people forever. But yeah, I mean, some historians have described it as a poisonous spirit after the First World War. the genie of hatred has been let out of the bottle and it can't really be contained. But it's also a period of trauma and of mourning and of people attempting to come to terms with just unspeakable and unfathomable loss. What's taken place, that pretty much everyone has lost someone. There's this communal grief, and religion plays its part in this, in providing comfort for people, in providing some sort of rationalization perhaps of loss. But interestingly, it's not all what we could call conventional faith, i.e., those different religious bodies I mentioned at the start of this talk who were there in 1914. There's an increased interest in different forms of spiritualism, this idea that you can communicate with people who have died, who have passed on, which is completely, as you can understand, psychologically understandable in 1918, 1919, because so many people have been lost. And there's this need, this desire to somehow, reach these people again. And there's very much a feeling retrospectively that the power, especially of the Anglican Church, of the state church, it never recovers its pre-1914 position. Britain is still, on the surface, a religious society, even a Christian society in 1919. But that absolute control of belief that maybe Anglicanism has before the war, that's never reattained. And there's a realization in the church itself that this is the case. It's interesting what happens, and I'll stop in a moment. What happens with those two figures I mentioned a few minutes ago, Cosmo Lang and Arthur Winnington Ingram. Cosmo Lang eventually becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. And the fact that he had the bravery to stand up in November 1914 and just give an honest account of the recent past very much works in his favour after the war. Winnington Ingram, the most popular religious figure of wartime, essentially becomes an embarrassment after the war is over because of his extreme hypernationalism, his jingoism with bellicose statements. There's an appreciation after the war within the church, Anglican Church especially, that it did not provide the moral leadership it should have done during the conflict. And that's where I'm going to stop. But I've got one more poll before we have time for general questions. Should the churches have supported the war effort? And should wider religious bodies, Christian and Jewish, supported the war effort during the war? Were they right to do so? What do we think? Everyone is saying yes, they were right to do so. Everyone thinks that's the right position for the churches to take. I mean, realistically, it was the only position that the churches could take, or other religious groups such as Jewish religious leadership in 1914, and especially the leaderships who feel they have a responsibility in a period of national crisis. But as I sort of mentioned, there's a lot of pushback against this after the First World War. In the 1920s and 1930s, there's a feeling that churches and the religious leaderships there should have been some sort of moral, at least moral nuance that wasn't there during the conflict. But I think, yeah, as the poll suggests, I don't think really religious institutions during the war itself, when you consider everything that was going on, this moment of national crisis and possibly, existential crisis, that religious bodies could do anything else.